The courtroom smelled like ozone and fear. David Walsh adjusted his tie and looked around at the sea of alien faces staring down at him. The Galactic Tribunal had built their justice hall to intimidate. Crystalline walls stretched up into darkness, and floating platforms held judges from a dozen different species. Each one looked like they could eat him for breakfast. The human ambassador sat alone at a tiny metal table in the center of it all. His briefcase rested beside him, along with a thermos of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. The aliens had been talking about him for 3 days now, using words like war criminal and threat to galactic peace. David mostly just tried to stay awake during the boring parts. High Inquisitor Velnara rose from her floating platform. She looked like a giant praying mantis wearing judicial robes. Her voice echoed through the chamber when she spoke, amplified by technology David didn't understand. "The defendant will stand," she announced. David got up, brushing crumbs from his lunch off his jacket. He had managed to get a sandwich from the court cafeteria during the break. It wasn't bad, though the alien equivalent of mustard tasted like cleaning fluid. "David Walsh of Earth," Velnara continued, "you have been found guilty of 17 counts of unauthorized expansion into protected space. Your species has violated the Centauri Accords, threatened established trade routes, and refused to submit to proper galactic authority." David nodded along politely. He had heard all this before. The humans had indeed set up colonies where they weren't supposed to. The thing was, nobody had told them they weren't supposed to. The galaxy was a big place, and the paperwork was apparently even bigger. Furthermore, the High Inquisitor's voice grew more dramatic. "Your military forces have shown complete disregard for diplomatic protocols. When confronted by Centauri peacekeeping vessels, human ships responded with what your species calls aggressive negotiations." That made David smile a little. Admiral Brooks had a way with words. Aggressive negotiations sounded much better. Then we shot first and asked questions later. Though to be fair, the Centauri ships had been aiming some very large guns at human freighters at the time. Around the courtroom, alien spectators leaned forward in their seats. Some had traveled from distant systems just to watch this trial. Humans were still new to the galactic community, and everyone wanted to see how the tribunal would handle them. Velnara spread her forearms wide, a gesture that David had learned meant something like extreme seriousness among her people. "The crimes of humanity cannot go unpunished. By the authority of the Galactic Tribunal, and in accordance with the sacred laws of cosmic justice, this court sentences David Walsh to death by molecular dissolution." A collective gasp went up from the spectators. Even for the tribunal, execution was rare. They usually preferred lengthy prison sentences or forced labor in the asteroid mines. Death sentences were reserved for the worst criminals in the galaxy. David waited for the dramatic pause to end, then reached into his jacket pocket. The guards tensed, hands moving toward their weapons. But David only pulled out a small tablet, computer, the kind humans use to keep track of appointments and grocery lists. He tapped the screen a few times, scrolling through what looked like a calendar. The courtroom watched in complete silence as he studied the display with the concentration of someone trying to remember if they had left the stove on. David said finally, looking up at the High Inquisitor. "Tuesday works better for me. Would 2 p.m. be all right? I've got a dentist appointment on Monday." The silence that followed was so complete that David could hear the hum of the anti-gravity platforms keeping the judges airborne. Velnara's compound eyes stared at him without blinking. Several alien spectators made sounds that their translators couldn't properly convert to English. "Excuse me?" Velnara finally managed. "Tuesday," David repeated helpfully. "For the execution thing. Monday's no good because Dr. Peterson finally had an opening and I've been trying to get this root canal scheduled for months. You know how it is with specialist appointments." High Judge Corvin, a being that looked like a cross between a jellyfish and a filing cabinet, floated forward. You wish to reschedule your execution?" "If that's possible, yeah." David looked around the courtroom like he was asking about changing a restaurant reservation. "I mean, I assume you folks have some flexibility here. It's not like I'm going anywhere." The translator systems were having trouble with some of the alien responses. Several judges appeared to be experiencing what humans might call system crashes. Their mouths moved, but no sounds came out. Velnara recovered first. This is unprecedented. The sacred laws do not provide for scheduling preferences in matters of cosmic justice. David shrugged. Look, I get it. You guys have procedures and everything. But from where I'm sitting, what's the difference if you kill me Monday or Tuesday? I'll still be just as dead, right? Judge Corvin made a sound like a deflating balloon. The difference is that Monday is the appointed time for your punishment. The cosmic order demands adherence to proper timing. Right, but who appointed the time? David asked. Was there a committee? Because if there's a committee, they can probably change it. Committees are great at changing things. Back on Earth, we've got committees that spend more time rescheduling meetings than actually having them. A smaller judge that looked like an angry houseplant spoke up. The timing was determined by this court according to established precedent and ceremonial requirements. Ceremonial requirements, David repeated, thoughtfully. So it's like a wedding or a graduation. Those get rescheduled all the time. My cousin's wedding got moved 3 times because of weather. Nobody seemed to think the cosmic order was particularly bothered by it. The plant judge rustled in what might have been frustration. This is not a wedding. This is the ultimate expression of galactic justice. Sure, I get that. Ultimate expression, very serious stuff. David looked back at his tablet. But here's the thing, and maybe this is just a human perspective. If you're going to do something ultimate, shouldn't you do it right? I mean, really put some thought into it? Velnara's head tilted in a way that suggested confusion. We have put thought into it. This trial has lasted for weeks. Oh, absolutely, great trial, very thorough. David nodded appreciatively, but I'm talking about the execution itself. You want it to be memorable, right? Something that sends the right message to other species? The judges exchanged glances, or the alien equivalent of glances. They were clearly not following David's logic, which was exactly what he was counting on. Well, David continued, if you execute me on Monday, half the galaxy's going to miss it because Monday's a terrible day for media coverage. Everyone's still getting caught up from the weekend. But Tuesday's perfect. Much better audience. Better timing for the news cycles across different time zones. Judge Corvin floated closer to David's table. You are advising us on how to execute you more effectively. Hey, if you're going to kill me, might as well do it right. David grinned. Besides, this is my first execution. I want to make sure I don't mess it up. The courtroom erupted in confused chatter. Alien voices mixed together in a cacophony that the translators gave up trying to interpret. High Inquisitor Velnara raised all 4 arms for silence. This court will recess, she announced, to consider this unusual request. As the judges filed out, David sat back down and opened his thermos. The coffee was definitely cold now, but it would have to do. He had just turned the most feared judicial body in the galaxy into a scheduling committee, and the best part was, they didn't even realize it yet. David spent the night in what the aliens called a holding cell but looked more like a hotel room with really good security. The bed was comfortable, the food wasn't terrible, and someone had thoughtfully provided him with reading material about galactic law. Most of it was incredibly boring, but David found it fascinating in the same way that tax codes could be fascinating to the right kind of person. By morning, he had filled 3 pages of notes. Guard Captain Thiss arrived to escort him back to the courtroom. She looked like a 7-foot-tall lizard wearing body armor, and she carried enough weapons to level a small building. David had learned that her species valued directness and efficiency above all else. The tribunal has reached a decision regarding your request, Thiss informed him as they walked through corridors lined with armed guards. That's great, David replied. I hope they went with Tuesday. I really do need to get that root canal taken care of. Thiss stopped walking and stared at him. You realize that they are planning to kill you, yes? Your molecular structure will be dissolved. You will cease to exist. Right, I got that part. David adjusted his tie. But until then, I still have to deal with everyday stuff. Dental health is important. My grandmother always said that. The guard captain made a sound that the translator rendered as confused hissing. Your species is very strange. You should meet my Uncle Bob, David said cheerfully. Now that guy's strange. They entered the courtroom to find it packed with even more spectators than before. Word had apparently spread about the human who wanted to reschedule his own execution. David waved politely to the crowd as he took his seat. High Inquisitor Velnara looked like she hadn't slept well. Her compound eyes were dim, and her usually pristine robes seemed wrinkled. When she spoke, her voice lacked its usual dramatic flair. After careful consideration, she announced, this tribunal has decided to accommodate your scheduling request. Your execution has been moved to Tuesday at 2 p.m. David smiled and made a note on his tablet. Excellent. Thank you for being so flexible. However, Velnara continued, there are certain procedural requirements that must be addressed before the sentence can be carried out. Of course there are, David said. I figured there would be paperwork. Judge Corvin floated forward carrying what appeared to be a stack of forms thick enough to use as a table. These documents must be completed and filed with the appropriate departments before your execution can proceed. David looked at the stack with genuine interest. Wow, that's a lot of forms. What are they all for? Death certificates, asset transfers, notification of next of kin, disposal of remains, cancellation of various registrations. Corvin began reading from a list. Termination of diplomatic immunity, revocation of travel permits, closure of bank accounts. Bank accounts, David interrupted. That reminds me, what happens to my pension? I've been paying into the Earth Diplomatic Service Retirement Fund for 15 years. Do I get a refund or does it transfer to my beneficiaries? The judges looked at each other in confusion. We do not know, Velnara admitted. Well, we should probably figure that out before you kill me, David said reasonably. I mean, it's a significant amount of money. Someone needs to handle it properly. Judge Corvin made notes on a smaller tablet. We will need to contact the appropriate financial authorities. And then there's my insurance, David continued. Life insurance, health insurance, diplomatic coverage. Some of those policies probably have specific clauses about executions. We should check the fine print. More note-taking. More confused murmuring from the spectators. Oh, and what about taxes? David asked. Do I file a final return, or does someone else handle that? Because tax season's coming up, and the Earth Revenue Service gets really cranky about late filings. High Inquisitor Velnara was starting to look overwhelmed. Perhaps we should establish a committee to handle these matters. Great idea, David agreed enthusiastically. Committees are perfect for this kind of thing. You'll probably want representatives from finance, legal, administration, maybe someone from interspecies relations to make sure everything's culturally appropriate. Culturally appropriate? Judge Corvin asked weakly. Well, sure. I mean, you're executing a human. There might be specific protocols for that. Different species probably have different requirements for how their people get killed. David pulled out a small notebook and started writing. In fact, we should probably research human execution customs to make sure you're doing this right. The plant-like judge that had spoken the day before rustled its leaves nervously. What kind of customs? Oh, all sorts of things, David said, vaguely. Traditional ceremonies, proper documentation, notification procedures. It's pretty complex stuff. You might want to bring in a cultural consultant. Velnara was now taking notes as fast as her forearms would allow. A cultural consultant. And don't forget about the environmental impact assessment, David added casually. Dead silence filled the courtroom. Environmental impact? Corvin asked in a voice barely above a whisper. Molecular dissolution, David explained. You're going to be breaking down my atomic structure and releasing it into the atmosphere, right? That's got to have some kind of environmental effect. Probably need permits for that sort of thing. The judges were now frantically passing notes back and forth. Several of them looked like they were developing headaches, assuming their species could get headaches. There's also the question of waste disposal, David continued thoughtfully. I mean, what happens to my leftover molecules? Do they just float around? Or do you have some kind of collection system? Because if they're just floating around, that could contaminate other areas. Might need a cleanup crew. Judge Corvin was making increasingly desperate notes. Cleanup, contamination, permits, oh, and worker safety, David added. The people operating the dissolution equipment, they're properly trained, right? Certified? Because molecular dissolution sounds like the kind of thing that requires specialized training. Probably union regulations, too. High Inquisitor Velnara stood up abruptly. This court will recess for an extended period while we address these procedural concerns. That sounds like a good plan, David said. Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere. As the judges filed out, David could hear them muttering about committees and consultants and environmental assessments. Guard Captain Thess approached his table, looking even more confused than before. What are you doing? She asked. David packed up his notes and smiled. Paperwork, he said simply. Turns out it's the same everywhere in the galaxy. Back in his cell that evening, David reviewed his progress. In 2 days, he had turned his execution into an administrative nightmare that would probably take months to sort out. The tribunal, designed to process criminals quickly and efficiently, was now drowning in its own bureaucracy. And the beautiful part was that every delay gave humanity more time to figure out what to do about their expanding colonial empire. The time the aliens finished processing his death certificate, the whole diplomatic situation might be resolved through other channels. David opened his notebook and started making a list of additional concerns he could raise tomorrow. There was still the matter of his library books, his gym membership, and that magazine subscription that never seemed to cancel properly. The galaxy's most feared judicial body was about to learn that the most dangerous weapon in the human arsenal wasn't military might or advanced technology. It was the ability to turn any simple process into an endless series of forms that had to be filled out in triplicate. 3 weeks had passed since David's original execution date, and the Galactic Tribunal was drowning in paperwork. What started as a simple death sentence had mushroomed into a bureaucratic disaster involving 17 different departments, 43 committees, and one very confused environmental safety inspector who was still trying to figure out the proper protocols for molecular disposal. David sat in his cell, which had been upgraded twice as his stay extended indefinitely. It now included a small desk, better lighting, and a coffee machine that the guards had installed after he'd politely mentioned that caffeine withdrawal might affect his ability to fill out forms properly. The aliens, he had discovered, were terrified of anything that might slow down their already glacial administrative process. Guard Captain Thys brought his breakfast along with the morning's batch of forms. She had started looking forward to these daily visits, partly because David was the most polite prisoner she'd ever supervised, and partly because watching him weaponize bureaucracy was like observing a master artist at work. The Cultural Appropriateness Committee has approved your request for a final meal, she announced, setting down a stack of papers 3 inches thick. David looked up from the form he was completing, something about the proper disposal of his personal effects. That's fantastic. How long did that take? 2 weeks and 4 days, Thys replied. They had to consult with experts on human dietary requirements, form a subcommittee on food safety, and get approval from the Interspecies Nutrition Council. Government efficiency at its finest, David said with a grin. So what's the process for actually getting this final meal? Thys handed him another set of forms. You need to submit a detailed menu with ingredients, preparation methods, and nutritional information. Then it goes to the Food Services Department, who will evaluate it for feasibility and cost. If approved, it goes to the Security Council to make sure none of the requested items can be used as weapons. David flipped through the forms with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely enjoyed complex procedures. This is great stuff, very thorough. Though I have to ask, what's the timeline on this? 6 to 8 weeks, assuming no complications. Complications? Well, if you request any foods that aren't available in this sector of the galaxy, they'll need to source them from Earth. That requires import permits, quality inspections, and approval from the Trade Regulation Authority. David made notes on his tablet. And how long would that take? 4 to 6 months. Thais said, beginning to look worried. You're not going to request anything complicated, are you? Define complicated, David said innocently. 2 hours later, David submitted his final meal request. The Food Services Department took one look at it and immediately called an emergency meeting. High Inquisitor Velnara stared at the menu in disbelief. He wants 7 courses. Food Services. Director Blix, a creature that looked like an anxious hedgehog, nodded miserably. 7 full courses, each with multiple components. He's requesting things called lobster thermidor, beef Wellington, and something called molecular gastronomy foam. What is molecular gastronomy foam? Judge Corvin asked. We don't know, Blix admitted. We've consulted with 3 different xenobiology experts and none of them have ever heard of it. We might need to bring in a specialist from Earth. A specialist from Earth, Velnara repeated slowly, to explain foam. There's more, Blix continued nervously. He's also requested that the meal be prepared by a chef from Earth using traditional human cooking methods. Apparently, the cultural significance of the final meal is compromised if it's not prepared authentically. Judge Corvin floated closer to the menu. Traditional human cooking methods. Fire, Blix said in a whisper. They cook their food with controlled fire, in enclosed spaces, on purpose. The assembled judges made various sounds of alarm. Most galactic species had moved beyond open flame cooking millions of years ago, viewing it as primitive and dangerous. The idea of intentionally setting fires inside their space station was terrifying. We'll need to install proper fire suppression systems, Blix continued. Get permits from the safety department. Probably evacuate the surrounding sectors while the cooking is taking place. How long will all of this take? Velnara asked, though she was beginning to suspect she didn't want to know the answer. Best case scenario? 4 months. That's assuming we can find a human chef willing to travel here. Get all the necessary permits and source all the ingredients. Blix paused. There's also the matter of his other request. Other request? He wants time to compose his final words. Apparently, it's a human tradition for condemned prisoners to make a final statement before execution. How much time? Judge Corvin asked weakly. He requested 48 hours of uninterrupted solitude to properly compose his thoughts. He says the statement needs to be meaningful and reflective, given the gravity of the situation. Velnara felt what humans might recognize as the beginning of a migraine. 48 hours to write a speech? He also mentioned that human final statements are often published and studied for historical significance, Blix added. He wants to make sure his words properly represent both human culture and the dignity of galactic justice. Published? Corvin squeaked. Apparently there are whole books of famous final words back on Earth. Some of them have become quite influential in human culture and philosophy. The judges exchanged increasingly panicked looks. The idea that this human's final words might be studied and quoted throughout the galaxy was terrifying. What if he said something that made the tribunal look bad? What if his words inspired other species to challenge galactic authority? There's also the matter of next of kin notification. Blix continued relentlessly. Mr. Walsh has provided a list of family members who need to be personally contacted before the execution can proceed. How many family members? Velnara asked, though she was sure she didn't want to know. 247. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Judge Corvin's anti-gravity platform, making a noise like a dying whale. He has 247 immediate family members? Velnara finally managed. According to human culture, Blix explained, immediate family includes parents, siblings, children, grandparents, grandchildren, aunts, uncles, cousins, in-laws, step relations, and adopted family members. Mr. Walsh comes from what he describes as a large, close-knit family. And they all need to be contacted personally? It's a matter of respect, Blix said, reading from David's cultural explanation. He says that in human society, it would be deeply disrespectful to execute someone without properly notifying their family. It could cause diplomatic incidents. Velnara closed all 4 of her eyes. How long will it take to contact 247 humans scattered across Earth? The communications department estimates 6 to 8 weeks, assuming they can reach everyone on the first try. Some of his relatives apparently live in remote areas with poor communication infrastructure. And if they can't reach everyone, then we have to wait and try again. Mr. Walsh was very clear that every family member needs to be notified. He provided detailed contact information for each one, along with notes about the best times to reach them and which ones prefer written communication versus voice calls. High Inquisitor Velnara realized that what had started as a simple execution was rapidly turning into the most complex logistical operation in tribunal history. They now needed to coordinate with multiple Earth-based organizations, import exotic foods, install fire safety equipment, hire cultural consultants, and somehow manage to contact nearly 250 humans without starting an interplanetary incident. And through it all, David Walsh sat in his cell, politely filling out forms and asking helpful questions about proper procedures. "There is one more thing," Blix said quietly. "More?" Corvin whispered. Mr. Walsh asked if we have proper translation equipment for his final statement. He wants to make sure that his words are accurately conveyed to all the different species who will be attending the execution. He suggested we might want to hire professional translators to ensure cultural nuances aren't lost. Velnara made a decision that would have far-reaching consequences for galactic jurisprudence. "Cancel the execution," she announced. "Cancel it?" Corvin asked in surprise. "Postpone it indefinitely while we sort out these cultural requirements," Velnara clarified. "We cannot risk executing this human improperly and creating a diplomatic crisis with Earth." As the judges filed out to begin the monumental task of managing David's cultural requests, none of them noticed the small smile on guard Captain Thiss's face. She had been watching David Walsh turn their entire legal system inside out, and she was starting to understand something that the judges hadn't figured out yet. Humans weren't just hard to kill because they were tough or stubborn. They were hard to kill because they could make the process of killing them so complicated that it wasn't worth the effort. 2 months had passed since David's execution was postponed, and the Galactic Tribunal complex had transformed into something resembling a small city, dedicated entirely to managing one human's death. The Cultural Affairs Department had expanded into 3 full floors. The Food Services Division was consulting with Earth-based culinary experts twice daily. The Communications Department had hired additional staff just to handle family notifications, and they were still only halfway through David's list of relatives. David sat in what could no longer be called a cell. His quarters now included a sitting area, a small kitchenette, and a bookshelf that Guard Captain Thiss had installed after he mentioned that reading helped him stay calm during stressful situations. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, that the tribunal was now working hard to keep their condemned prisoner comfortable and happy. Today's guard rotation included Officer Krex, a young soldier from the Arcturus system who looked like a blue-skinned bear wearing armor. He was new to the assignment and still seemed nervous around David, which amused the human ambassador considerably. "Officer Krex," David said, looking up from a book about galactic trade regulations. "You seem worried about something. Everything all right?" Krex shifted uncomfortably, his massive frame making the chair creak. "I have been reading about your species," he admitted. "The things I found were concerning." David marked his place in the book and gave Krex his full attention. "What kind of things?" "Wars," Krex said quietly. "So many wars. Your species has been fighting constantly for thousands of years. Even when you ran out of other species to fight, you fought each other." "That's true," David agreed easily. "We've gotten pretty good at it over the years." Krex's fur rippled, and what David had learned was a sign of anxiety among his people. The reports describe weapons that can destroy entire cities, bombs that poison the ground for generations, gases that dissolve living tissue. "Chemical weapons are nasty stuff," David nodded. "We banned most of them after a while. Well, officially banned them. There's always someone who thinks they can get away with using them anyway." "How do you live with that?" Krex asked. "Knowing that your own species creates such terrible things?" David considered the question seriously. Same way you live with knowing that someday you're going to die. It's just part of the reality we deal with. The trick is not to let it paralyze you. Guard Captain Thiss entered the room carrying David's afternoon meal and a fresh stack of paperwork from the Administrative Coordination Committee. She had started joining these conversations, finding them oddly educational. Mr. Walsh was just explaining human attitudes toward warfare, Krex told her. Thiss set down the food and took her usual seat. This should be interesting. We've been studying human military history as part of the cultural assessment process. Your species seems to have a very unusual relationship with violence. Unusual how? David asked, unwrapping what appeared to be the alien equivalent of a sandwich. Most species develop advanced warfare capabilities and then use them to establish dominance, Thiss explained. The strong rule the weak until someone stronger comes along. But humans seem to fight constantly without any clear pattern of dominance. David chewed thoughtfully. That's because we don't really fight for dominance, not usually anyway. We fight for ideas. Ideas. Freedom, religion, territory, resources, revenge, justice, independence, ideology. David counted them off on his fingers. Sometimes we fight just because we disagree about the right way to organize society. Those are the worst wars, actually. It's easier to negotiate with someone who wants your land than someone who thinks your entire way of life is evil. Krex leaned forward, his curiosity overcoming his nervousness. But how do you survive it? All that violence, all that destruction? Practice, David said simply. And jokes. Jokes? Thiss asked. Gallows humor, we call it. The worse things get, the more we joke about it. Helps keep people sane when everything around them is insane. David took another bite of his sandwich. My grandfather fought in World War II. Biggest, nastiest war in human history up to that point. 50 million people died. You know what he told me about it? Both guards shook their heads. He said the thing that kept him going wasn't patriotism or duty or any of that noble stuff. It was his squad mates making jokes about how terrible the food was and betting on whether they'd survive long enough to complain about it tomorrow. Krex made a confused sound. They joked about dying? All the time. See? Here's the thing about humans. We figured out a long time ago that death is inevitable. Everything dies eventually. People, civilizations, planets, stars, probably the whole universe someday. So you can either spend your time being terrified of death or you can accept it and focus on living. David stood up and walked over to his bookshelf, pulling out a thick volume about human history. Want to know something interesting? Some of our best medical advances came from war, battlefield surgery, trauma treatment, prosthetics, mental health care. We got so good at dealing with death that we started getting better at preventing it. He flipped through the pages until he found what he was looking for. Look at this. During our Civil War, doctors performed over 60,000 amputations. Sounds horrible, right? But those doctors got so much practice that they revolutionized surgical techniques. Survival rates improved dramatically. Thiss studied the pictures with professional interest. Your military medics must be incredibly skilled. The best in the galaxy, probably, David agreed. They have to be. See, most species avoid conflict, when possible. They fight when they have to, but they try to minimize casualties. Humans are different. We fight so often that we've had to get really, really good at keeping people alive during and after combat. He turned more pages, showing images of field hospitals, medical evacuation procedures, and rehabilitation centers. This is from our war in Vietnam. The survival rate for wounded soldiers who made it to a field hospital was 98%. 98%. That's better than most civilian hospitals achieve today. Krex stared at the images. They look so calm, like they're just doing their jobs. That's exactly what they're doing, David said. When death becomes routine, you develop routines for dealing with it. Triage protocols, evacuation procedures, psychological support systems. We've systematized survival. He sat back down and looked at his guard seriously. You want to know what scares me about this whole execution thing? It's not dying. Humans die all the time. It's dying badly. Badly? Thais asked. Wastefully, pointlessly, without meaning. David gestured around his comfortable quarters. Don't get me wrong. I appreciate all the effort everyone's putting into making this culturally appropriate. But from a human perspective, all this bureaucracy and delay isn't showing respect for life. It's showing fear of death. The guards exchanged glances. Fear? Krex asked. Sure. You're so terrified of killing me wrong that you can't bring yourselves to kill me at all. That tells me that death is still a big, scary unknown to your species. You haven't integrated it into your daily reality the way humans have. David opened his book again and found another section. Here's something that might interest you. During World War I, human soldiers lived in trenches for months at a time. Constant artillery bombardment, machine gun fire, poison gas attacks. Death everywhere all the time. You know what they did? He showed them photographs of soldiers playing cards, reading letters, and sharing meals in bunkers. They kept living. They made friends, told stories, played games, fell in love, wrote poetry. Some of the best literature in human history was written in those trenches. Thais studied the images with growing understanding. They normalized it. Exactly. They made death so ordinary that life could continue around it. David closed the book. That's what your tribunal doesn't understand. You're trying to use death as a tool of intimidation against a species that uses death as a tool of education. Education? Krex asked. Every human death teaches the survivors something. How to live better, fight smarter, love deeper, work harder. We don't just mourn our dead. We learn from them. David smiled at his guards. Even this execution, assuming you eventually get around to it, will teach other humans something valuable. What will it teach them? Thais asked quietly. David's smile widened. That the Galactic Tribunal can be defeated by proper paperwork and polite persistence. That sometimes the best way to fight overwhelming force isn't with bigger guns, but with bigger bureaucracy. The guard sat in contemplative silence, processing this new perspective on human psychology. Finally, Krex spoke up. No wonder the High Inquisitor looks so tired lately. David laughed, the sound echoing through corridors, where laughter was rarely heard. She's learning something too, she just doesn't know it yet. Outside, the tribunal's administrative machinery continued its grinding work, processing forms and scheduling meetings and consulting experts about the proper way to execute one very patient human. None of them realized that David Walsh had already accomplished his real mission. He had taught the galaxy's most feared judicial body that humans weren't just hard to kill, they were impossible to intimidate. The day of David's rescheduled execution had finally arrived, though finally was a relative term. What was supposed to happen on a Tuesday afternoon 3 months ago was now scheduled for a Thursday morning in what the aliens called the optimal administrative window. The Galactic Tribunal had spent more time planning this single execution than most species spent planning entire wars. David stood in his quarters, adjusting his tie one last time. He wore his best diplomatic suit, freshly pressed by the Tribunal's laundry service, which had required a 2-week consultation with Earth-based experts on proper human formal wear care. His final meal sat on the table, still warm from the kitchen where Chef Rodriguez had prepared it using the specially installed fire cooking equipment that had cost more than most starships. The meal had been spectacular. 7 courses of perfectly prepared human cuisine, each dish crafted with ingredients imported from Earth at enormous expense and bureaucratic complexity. David had savored every bite, not because it might be his last meal, but because it represented the triumph of human administrative warfare over galactic efficiency. Guard Captain Thys entered with the final escort detail. Over the months of David's extended stay, she had become something like a friend, or at least a professional colleague who happened to be preparing to watch him die. "The tribunal is ready for you," she announced formally, though her tone carried a note of something that might have been regret. "Excellent," David replied, picking up a small briefcase. "I just need to grab my presentation materials." Thys blinked. "Presentation materials?" "For my final statement. I mentioned that I wanted to make sure my words had proper impact, right? Well, I put together a little slideshow. Nothing fancy, just some charts and graphs to help illustrate my points. The escort detail exchanged confused glances. In all their years of executing condemned criminals, none of them had ever encountered someone who wanted to use visual aids during their final words. They walked through corridors lined with spectators. Word of the human's execution had spread throughout the galaxy, and representatives from dozens of species had come to witness the event. Some were there out of curiosity about human death customs. Others wanted to see how the tribunal handled their most administratively complex execution in history. The execution chamber had been completely redesigned to accommodate David's cultural requirements. What was once a simple room with a molecular dissolution platform was now a sophisticated amphitheater with proper lighting, acoustics, translation equipment, recording devices, and a small stage for final statements. The cost overruns had required approval from 3 different budget committees. High Inquisitor Velnara stood at her podium, looking older and more tired than she had at the beginning of this ordeal. The months of delays, complications, and administrative nightmares had taken their toll. Her usually pristine robes hung loose on her frame, and her compound eyes had developed what humans might recognize as stress lines around the edges. "David Walsh," she announced as he entered, "you have been brought here today to face the sentence that was lawfully imposed upon you by this tribunal. Are you prepared to proceed?" David walked calmly to the platform where the dissolution device waited. The machine itself was surrounded by safety barriers, monitoring equipment, and a small army of technicians who had spent weeks calibrating it for human physiology. "I am," David replied. "But before we begin, I have a few final observations to share, as is my cultural right." He opened his briefcase and pulled out a small projector, which he set up on a table that hadn't been there 3 months ago. The first slide appeared on the wall behind him. "Optimizing Galactic Justice Systems, a case study in administrative efficiency." Judge Corvin made a sound like a deflating balloon. "This is your final statement?" "Part of it," David said cheerfully. "I've had a lot of time to think during these past few months, and I realize that my experience here represents a unique opportunity for institutional improvement." He clicked to the next slide, which showed a flowchart of the tribunal's execution process. "When we started this journey 3 months ago, your standard execution timeline was approximately 72 hours from sentencing to completion. My case has taken 96 days and counting. That represents a 13,000% increase in processing time." Murmurs rippled through the assembled spectators. Several judicial officials were frantically taking notes. Now some might see this as a failure of the system. David continued, advancing to a slide showing cost comparisons. "My execution has required the services of 47 different departments, generated over 3,000 individual forms, and cost approximately 2.3 million galactic credits in administrative overhead." High Inquisitor Velnara was staring at the numbers with growing horror. 2.3 million credits? "That's just the direct costs," David explained. "If we factor in opportunity, costs, delayed cases, and the administrative personnel hours devoted to my case, we're looking at closer to 4.1 million credits." He clicked to the next slide, which showed a graph comparing his execution costs to the average military budget of a small planet. For the cost of killing one human diplomat, you could have purchased a fleet of patrol ships or funded a colonial terraforming project. The audience was now paying very close attention. Several species were calculating how much it would cost to execute their own diplomatic personnel using tribunal procedures. "But here's the interesting part," David continued, his enthusiasm for the subject matter clearly genuine. "This dramatic increase in complexity isn't actually a bug in your system. It's a feature. You've created a judicial process so thorough and comprehensive that it's virtually impossible to execute anyone quickly or cheaply." Judge Corvin floated closer to the projection screen. "You're saying our system is too efficient?" "I'm saying your system is too good at what it was designed to do," David corrected. "Look at these numbers." The next slide showed execution statistics for the past century. In the last 100 years, the Galactic Tribunal has sentenced 47 individuals to death. Of those, 31 appeals were successful, 12 sentences were commuted to lesser punishments, and only 4 executions were actually carried out. He paused to let that sink in. That's a 91.5% survival rate for death sentences. Either your justice system is remarkably merciful, or it's so complex that actually executing someone is practically impossible. Velnara was now studying the slides with the intensity of someone having a professional revelation. We never calculated those statistics. I had a lot of time on my hands, David said with a shrug. The point is, you've accidentally created the most humane justice system in galactic history. You just disguised it as bureaucratic efficiency. He advanced to his final slide, which showed a simple organizational chart. My recommendation is that you embrace this reality and reorganize accordingly. Instead of the Galactic Tribunal for Cosmic Justice, you could rebrand as the Galactic Center for Judicial Rehabilitation and Administrative Excellence. Same basic function, but with honest marketing. The execution chamber had fallen completely silent. David closed his briefcase and walked over to the dissolution platform. Anyway, those are my final words. Well, most of them. I also wanted to thank everyone who worked so hard to make this execution culturally appropriate. The attention to detail has been remarkable. High Inquisitor Velnara stared at him for a long moment. Mr. Walsh, she said finally, do you actually want to be executed? David considered the question seriously. Not particularly, no, but I understand that you have procedures to follow and a reputation to maintain. I'm prepared to cooperate with whatever decision you make. What if we decided not to execute you? Then I'd probably ask about my travel expense reimbursement and whether you folks need any help streamlining your administrative processes, David replied. I've gotten pretty familiar with your systems over the past few months. Velnara looked around the chamber at the assembled judges, officials, and spectators. Then she looked at the dissolution platform with its army of technicians and safety equipment. Finally, she looked at the cost projections still glowing on the wall. This tribunal hereby commutes your death sentence to indefinite consultation. On administrative efficiency, she announced. Your expertise in bureaucratic optimization will be retained on a contractual basis to help improve our judicial processes. David nodded thoughtfully. That sounds reasonable. What's the pay scale like? And do you offer dental coverage? As the crowd dispersed and the dissolution platform was powered down, Guard Captain Thiss approached David with something that might have been admiration. You knew this would happen, she said. I hoped it would happen, David corrected. Turns out the best way to avoid being executed by a bureaucracy is to make the execution more expensive than keeping you alive. He packed up his projector and looked around the chamber one last time. Besides, they need the help. Have you seen their filing system? It's a disaster. 6 months later, David Walsh occupied a comfortable office in the Tribunal's Administrative Excellence Division, which he had helped establish. His first major project was implementing a new case management system that reduced average processing time by 60%, while maintaining the same thoroughness that made executions prohibitively expensive. The Galactic Tribunal still sentenced criminals to death occasionally, but the David Walsh precedent had established such comprehensive procedural requirements that most cases were resolved through alternative means long before reaching the execution stage. Human diplomats throughout the galaxy began receiving copies of David's presentation, along with detailed instructions on how to weaponize bureaucracy when faced with superior force. And somewhere in the depths of the tribunal's vast filing system, stamped in triplicate and properly notarized, sat David's original death warrant with a single notation in the margin. Rescheduled indefinitely pending administrative review.